The Montgomery estate sat behind golden gates like a fortress of perfection, 12 bedrooms, marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, and a garden so pristine it looked painted. Inside, Victoria Montgomery had everything money could buy. Designer clothes hanging in walk-in closets, cars worth more than most homes, and a reputation as one of New York's most influential philanthropists. She had conquered boardrooms, charity galas, and society pages, but there was one battle she was losing, and it was destroying her from the inside out. Her 5-year-old son, James, screamed through another night, his cries echoing through hallways that had never known such desperate sounds. 7 nannies had failed. 7 experts had walked away. The doctors had no answers, but there was one person watching from the shadows, someone no one paid attention to, someone whose quiet observations would soon reveal a truth that would shatter everything the Montgomerys thought they knew. The Montgomery mansion wasn't just a home, it was a statement. Perched on 5 acres in the Hamptons, the estate commanded attention with its limestone facade, manicured hedges shaped into geometric perfection, and an infinity pool that seemed to spill into the ocean beyond. Inside, crystal chandeliers caught afternoon light and scattered it across walls adorned with original Monets and Picassos. This was where Victoria Montgomery had built her empire of influence, where senators and celebrities mingled at fundraisers, where every detail whispered wealth and control. But in the East Wing, behind a hand-carved mahogany door, perfection crumbled. James Montgomery was 5 years old, with his mother's dark hair and his late father's grey eyes. He should have been the crown jewel of the family legacy, the heir who would carry the Montgomery name into another generation of power. Instead, he was a mystery that money couldn't solve. Diagnosed with severe autism at age 3, James existed in a world that seemed separated from everyone else by an invisible wall. He didn't speak. He didn't make eye contact. When overwhelmed, he would rock back and forth, his small hands flapping frantically, his screams piercing enough to shatter the mansion's carefully maintained tranquility. Victoria had tried everything. She'd flown in specialists from Johns Hopkins, consulted with behavioral therapists from Switzerland, and hired nannies trained in the most advanced techniques for children with special needs. Each one arrived with impressive credentials and confident promises. Each one left defeated, sometimes in tears, always with the same message. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Montgomery. I've never seen a case quite like this." The first nanny, Margaret, had lasted 3 weeks. A British woman in her 50s with 30 years of experience, she'd arrived with a structured schedule and calm demeanor. By week 2, James had bitten her hard enough to draw blood during a meltdown. She departed with a bandaged hand and a look of exhausted relief. The second nanny, Svetlana, came highly recommended from a family in Monaco. She spoke 4 languages and had a master's degree in child psychology. She lasted 18 days. James had destroyed her carefully organized sensory room, tearing apart weighted blankets and throwing therapeutic toys with such force that one cracked a window. When Victoria found Svetlana crying in the hallway at midnight, the nanny whispered, "He doesn't want help. He doesn't want anyone." After 2 months of trying, Victoria's carefully maintained composure was fracturing. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, makeup couldn't quite conceal. Board meetings became torture as she wondered if her phone would ring with another emergency. Her friends began avoiding her calls, uncomfortable with her desperation. The society pages that once celebrated her now whispered about the Montgomery problem. Nanny number 3 was Carlos, a male specialist who'd worked with autistic children in crisis facilities. He lasted 12 days before James pushed him down the main staircase during a particularly violent episode. Carlos walked away with a sprained ankle and refused the settlement check Victoria offered, wanting nothing more than to forget the Montgomery estate existed. Then came Dr. Patricia Brennan, not a nanny, but a renowned behavioral specialist who'd written 3 books on autism intervention. Victoria paid her $50,000 for a month-long intensive program. Dr. Brennan lasted 16 days. She left with pages of notes, detailed observations, and a single devastating conclusion. Mrs. Montgomery, your son may require institutional care. There are facilities that specialize in cases this severe. The word institutional hung in Victoria's mind like a death sentence. She'd been to those facilities during her charity work: sterile rooms, overworked staff, children who rocked in corners with no one to hold them. She would die before letting James end up there. By the fifth nanny, Victoria had stopped learning their names immediately. This one was young, enthusiastic, fresh from a graduate program in special education. She lasted 8 days. James had a meltdown during dinner, and when the nanny tried to implement a de-escalation technique, he'd thrown his plate with such accuracy it struck her in the face, breaking her nose. Victoria drove her to the emergency room herself, writing another check she hoped would ensure discretion. The sixth nanny was older, grandmother-like, with kind eyes that had seen decades of difficult children. She lasted 19 days, the longest so far. For a moment, Victoria allowed herself hope. Then came the night James escaped his room at 2 a.m. and was found standing at the edge of the pool in his pajamas, unseeing and unresponsive, while the nanny slept through her alarm. Victoria fired her at dawn, her voice shaking not with anger but with terror at what could have happened. Nanny number 7 was Maria, a woman who'd worked with autistic children in group homes for 15 years. She arrived with references that read like testimonials and a calm, unshakable presence. Victoria hired her on the spot and prayed harder than she had since her husband's death 3 years ago. For 3 weeks, Maria stayed. She weathered James's screaming fits, his food refusals, his violent rejections of comfort. She implemented routines, created visual schedules, spoke to him in soft, steady tones, even when he covered his ears and shrieked. Victoria began to believe Maria might be the miracle they needed. Then, on a Tuesday evening in late September, Victoria returned from a board meeting to find Maria standing in the foyer with her bags packed. The woman's face was grey, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. "I can't stay," Maria said, her voice hollow. "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm sorry, but I can't. Today he looked at me, and there was something in his eyes, not anger, not frustration. It was like," she paused, searching for words. "It was like he was drowning, and every time I tried to help, I was pushing him further. I don't know how to explain it, but I can't be the one to do that to a child." Victoria stood frozen as Maria walked out the door, leaving her alone in a mansion that suddenly felt enormous and empty. Upstairs, James was silent, the kind of silence that was somehow worse than screaming. That's when Victoria noticed her. Grace Williams had been cleaning the Montgomery estate for 6 months, arriving 3 times a week through the service entrance, invisible in her simple uniform. She was 42 years old, with skin the color of deep mahogany and silver threading through her short, natural hair. Her movements were quiet and efficient, polishing marble without making a sound, dusting priceless art with steady hands, emptying trash bins as if she were erasing evidence of human existence. Victoria had hired her through an agency and had probably spoken directly to her 5 times in 6 months. Grace was part of the machinery that kept the estate running, no more notable than the automated sprinkler system or the security cameras. She arrived at 7 a.m. on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, worked her 8 hours, and left through the same door she'd entered, collecting her check with a polite, "Thank you, ma'am," that Victoria barely registered. But Grace noticed things. She noticed that James's meltdowns followed patterns, worse on days when the house was filled with the chemical smell of new cleaning products, calmer on days when the routine was undisturbed. She noticed that he covered his ears most violently when the nannies used high-pitched, sing-song voices to try to engage him. She noticed that he calmed slightly when left alone in dim rooms, but grew agitated under the mansion's bright designer lighting. Grace noticed because she understood what it meant to be unseen. She noticed because she'd raised 3 children of her own in a 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, learning to read their needs from small signs because there was no money for specialists or therapists. She noticed because 30 years of cleaning other people's homes had taught her to observe everything while appearing to see nothing. On the evening Maria left, Grace was in the east wing, cleaning the hallway outside James's room. She'd watched the nanny descend the stairs with her packed bags, seeing the defeat in her posture. Through the door, she could hear James, not screaming, but making a low, constant humming sound that raised the hair on her arms. Grace had heard that sound before. Her youngest son, Marcus, used to make a similar sound when he was overwhelmed, before she'd learned what triggered his sensory overload and how to create a calm environment despite their cramped quarters and the constant noise of city life bleeding through thin walls. She stood in the hallway, cleaning supplies in hand, listening. The humming rose and fell, a wordless song of distress that no one else seemed to hear. Inside that room was a child who'd been poked, analyzed, and subjected to 7 different approaches to fixing him. A child who was drowning, just as Maria had said, but not because there was something wrong with him that couldn't be helped. Grace set down her supplies and moved closer to the door. But what Grace Williams noticed next would change everything. Grace had learned long ago that cleaning gave her access to the truth of people's lives. She saw the prescriptions in bathroom cabinets, the empty wine bottles in recycling bins, the credit card bills left on desks. She saw without judging, cleaned without commenting, and left no trace of her observations. But over the past 6 months, she'd been observing something that troubled her deeply. It started small. She'd be cleaning James's playroom and notice that his toys were arranged in perfect, rigid lines, not by him, but by whichever nanny was currently in charge. The arrangement looked orderly, but Grace noticed that James never touched the toys when they were like that. He'd stand at the edge of the room, rocking slightly, until someone disrupted the arrangement. Only then would he engage, but his engagement was always seen as destructive, knocking the toys over, throwing them, screaming when anyone tried to rebuild the careful arrangement. She noticed the schedules posted on James's wall, each nanny's version more detailed than the last. Wake time, 7 o'clock a.m. sharp. Breakfast, 7:30 a.m. Educational play, 8:30 a.m. The schedules were rigid, timed to the minute, with no flexibility. Grace had watched James stare at these schedules with something like panic in his eyes. She noticed the sensory room that Dr. Brennan had installed, supposedly designed to help James regulate his overwhelm. But the room was filled with bright colors, textured walls meant to be touched, and equipment that made soft musical sounds. Grace had seen James enter that room exactly once. He'd lasted 45 seconds before beginning to scream. 3 days after Maria left, Victoria hadn't hired a replacement yet. Grace arrived for her Thursday shift to find the mansion in unusual disarray. Victoria had apparently spent the night downstairs, empty coffee cups on the living room table, her laptop still open to autism treatment facility websites she'd been desperately researching. Grace cleaned quietly, working her way upstairs to the east wing. James's door was closed, no sound coming from within. She began cleaning the hallway, but something made her pause. The door was slightly ajar. Victoria must have checked on him and not closed it fully. Through the gap, Grace could see into the room. James sat on the floor in the corner farthest from the window, his knees pulled to his chest, rocking slowly. The morning sun blazed through the window, hitting him directly. The overhead light was on as well, making the room almost painfully bright. Every few seconds, James would squeeze his eyes shut, then open them, then shut them again, his rocking increasing in tempo. Grace felt something tighten in her chest. She'd seen this before. Marcus used to do the same thing when the fluorescent lights at his school gave him headaches. But when she'd explained this to his teachers, they'd dismissed her. "He's just being difficult," they'd said. It had taken 2 years and a new school with understanding staff before Marcus could make it through a day without a meltdown. She glanced down the hallway. No one was coming. Victoria was still downstairs, likely sleeping off her exhaustion. Grace made a decision that violated every rule of her position. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. James's head snapped up, his eyes wide and unfocused. For a moment, Grace thought he might scream, might have one of the violent reactions she'd heard about. She froze, keeping her body language calm and non-threatening. But James didn't scream. He stared at her with those grey eyes, and she saw what Maria had described, a drowning child, desperate for help, but unable to ask for it. Grace moved slowly to the window and drew the curtains, dimming the harsh sunlight. Then she reached up and switched off the overhead light. The room fell into a gentle shadow, lit only by the soft glow filtering through the curtains. James's rocking slowed. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to even out. Grace stood still, not approaching him, not speaking. She'd learned with Marcus that sometimes the greatest gift you could give an overwhelmed child was silence and space. After 2 minutes, James uncurled slightly. After 5, he was still. Grace slowly backed toward the door, not turning away from him, respecting his space. As she reached the threshold, she heard something that made her breath catch. A hum. Low and musical, not the distressed sound from the night Maria left, but something almost peaceful. She stepped into the hallway and pulled the door almost closed, leaving it exactly as she'd found it. Her heart was pounding. She'd just done something she had no authority to do and could be fired for, but she'd also just seen something 7 trained professionals had missed. James didn't need brighter lights and cheerful colors and constant structured stimulation. He needed the exact opposite. Grace picked up her cleaning supplies with shaking hands. She had a choice to make. She could say nothing, keep her job, stay invisible, or she could speak up and risk everything, her employment, her reputation, the agency potentially blacklisting her for overstepping her role. But then she thought of Marcus and the 2 years he'd suffered because no one would listen to a poor black mother who cleaned houses for a living. The next Saturday, Grace arrived at 7 a.m. as usual. Victoria was in the kitchen, looking even more haggard than before. She was on her phone, voice tight with frustration. "I understand you're fully booked, but I'm willing to pay double your rate," Victoria said into the phone. "My son he's in crisis, and I need someone immediately." A pause. "I see. Yes, if anything opens up, thank you." She ended the call and dropped her phone on the marble counter with more force than intended. That's when she noticed Grace standing in the doorway with her supplies. "Oh, Grace, right, yes, the usual cleaning today." Victoria rubbed her eyes. "I'm sorry, you might hear, James isn't doing well. I'm trying to find someone who can help him, but," she trailed off, vulnerability cracking through her usual composed exterior. Grace stood still for a moment, decades of ingrained deference warring with what she'd observed. The words formed in her throat, dangerous words that could change everything. "Mrs. Montgomery," she said quietly, may I say something?" Victoria looked up, surprise registering on her face. In 6 months, Grace had never initiated a conversation beyond basic pleasantries. "Of course," Victoria said, though her tone suggested she expected a request for schedule changes or supplies. Grace took a breath. "I've noticed some things about James, about what seems to make his episodes worse." She kept her voice level, professional, trying to sound helpful rather than presumptuous. "I know it's not my place, but I raised 3 children and my youngest, he had some similar struggles, and I thought maybe—" "You're right," Victoria interrupted, and Grace's heart sank. "It's not your place." The words hung between them, sharp and dismissive. Victoria's face had closed off, the vulnerability replaced by the armor of class and authority. "I appreciate your concern, but James is being treated by specialists. I don't think," she paused, clearly trying to soften the rejection. "I'm sure you did your best with your children, but James's condition is complex. It requires professional intervention." Grace nodded slowly, the familiar sting of dismissal settling in her chest. "Of course, ma'am, I apologize for overstepping." She turned to leave, to return to her role as the invisible woman who cleaned and said nothing. But as she reached the door, she heard it, from upstairs, the beginning of one of James's screams, a sound of pure agony that made both women flinch. Victoria's face crumpled. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, more to herself than to Grace. "I've tried everything, and he's just getting worse." Grace should have left it alone. She should have continued her work, collected her check, and left the Montgomerys to their own problems. But that night, she lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, hearing James's screams echoing in her memory. The next Tuesday, she arrived with a plan. She would observe more carefully, document what she saw, and find a way to make Victoria listen, even if it meant risking her job. Over the following 2 weeks, Grace became a detective in plain sight. She watched and noted everything, using her position as cleaning staff to access every room, every corner of James's world. She noticed that the house was never quiet. Even when there were no people talking, there was always sound, the hum of the advanced HVAC system, the beeping of smart home devices, the soft music Victoria kept playing through hidden speakers to create ambience. Grace started timing James's meltdowns against these ambient sounds. The correlation was striking. She noticed that James's bedroom was cleaned with industrial-strength products that left a strong chemical smell. The sheets were washed in heavily scented detergent. The air fresheners Victoria had installed released bursts of fragrance every 15 minutes. She noticed that well-meaning staff kept trying to hug James, hold his hand, pat his head. She watched him recoil from each touch, his distress building until it exploded into violence that was then labeled as aggression. Most importantly, Grace noticed the new nanny. Victoria had finally hired number 8, a woman named Patricia Chen, who came with glowing recommendations and a strict behavioral modification approach. Patricia believed in what she called gentle persistence, constantly engaging James, refusing to let him retreat into his corner, always talking to him in bright, enthusiastic tones. Grace watched Patricia's first week with growing dread. Every instinct told her this was wrong, but she had no authority to speak. She was the cleaning woman. She cleaned and left. On Patricia's 8th day, Grace was cleaning the hallway when she heard raised voices from James's room. She paused, hand tightening on her mop. "James, we need to practice our words," Patricia was saying in that sing-song voice that made Grace wince. "Can you say I want? Come on, sweetie, I know you can do it, say I want." Silence, then the sound of movement, something being knocked over. No, Patricia's voice grew firmer. "We don't throw things. We use our words. Now try again, say I want." More silence. Grace could picture James in there, overwhelmed, shutting down. "James, I'm not going to give up on you," Patricia continued relentlessly. "I know you can speak. The doctors said you can make sounds, so let's practice. Say." The scream that erupted was unlike any Grace had heard before. It was a sound of absolute desperation, a child being pushed past every limit of endurance. Grace dropped her mop and moved to the door without thinking. Through the opening, she saw James on the floor, hands over his ears, rocking violently. Patricia stood over him, frustration and determination mixing on her face. "This is part of the process," Patricia said, more to herself than to James. "We push through the resistance. That's how progress happens." Grace's hands clenched into fists. She thought of Marcus, of the teacher who'd used similar logic. "We can't let him retreat. We have to make him engage." She thought of the months of trauma that had caused the regression, the nightmares. She couldn't stay silent anymore. "Excuse me," Grace said from the doorway, her voice cutting through James's screams. Patricia spun around, surprised. "Can I help you?" Grace stepped into the room, breaking another rule, but she was past caring. "He doesn't need words right now. He needs to be quiet." Patricia's expression shifted from surprise to indignation. "I'm sorry, but I'm a trained professional. I don't think a housekeeper is qualified to—" "I'm not qualified," Grace interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You're right, but I'm also not deaf, and I can hear that he's begging you to stop. He's nonverbal. He can't beg for anything. That scream is begging." Grace moved to the window and closed the curtains like she'd done weeks ago. "That rocking is begging. Every part of his body is saying stop, and you're not listening." Patricia's face flushed red. "Mrs. Montgomery hired me because I have a proven method. Children with autism need structure, consistency, and he needs you to leave him alone." The words hung in the air. James's screaming had quieted to sobs, but he was still curled on the floor, hands over his ears. Patricia pulled herself up to her full height. "I'm going to speak to Mrs. Montgomery about this. You're completely out of line." "Then speak to her," Grace said quietly. "Tell her that her son was begging you to stop, and you wouldn't." Patricia left the room, her footsteps angry on the marble hallway. Grace heard her descending the stairs, calling for Victoria. Grace stood in the dimmed room, adrenaline making her hands shake. She just ended her employment at the Montgomery estate, she was certain. But as she looked at James, still curled on the floor but quieting in the dim silence, she knew she couldn't have done anything else. Slowly, carefully, Grace lowered herself to the floor several feet away from James. She didn't reach for him, didn't speak, didn't try to engage. She just sat, her presence calm and undemanding. Minutes passed. James's breathing slowed. His hands gradually lowered from his ears. Then, so softly Grace almost missed it, he hummed, that low musical sound. And this time, it sounded almost like gratitude. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, multiple people. Victoria's voice, tight with anger, Patricia's, defending her methods. Grace braced herself for the confrontation. But what Victoria Montgomery saw when she burst into that room would change everything she thought she knew. Victoria stopped in the doorway, Patricia behind her, ready to launch into accusations. But the words died on Victoria's lips. Grace sat on the floor, her back against the wall, several feet from James. She wasn't touching him, wasn't speaking to him, wasn't doing anything except existing in calm, quiet solidarity. And James, who hadn't voluntarily been near another human being in months, was sitting up, looking at Grace with something that almost resembled peace on his small face. "Mrs. Montgomery," Patricia began, her voice sharp, "this woman came into the room and completely undermined my session. Get out," Victoria said quietly. Patricia stopped mid-sentence. "Excuse me, get out of this room." Now Patricia's face went white, then red. "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm trying to help your son. What she did was completely unprofessional, and you're fired," Victoria said, her voice hollow. "I'll pay you for the full 2 weeks we agreed upon, but I need you to leave my home. Today." Patricia sputtered, then looked at Grace with pure venom. "You can have him. Good luck with a child you think doesn't need professional help." "You'll learn," she stormed out. Victoria stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at Grace and James. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What did you do?" "I turned off the lights and closed the curtains," Grace said simply. "And I stopped talking." Victoria had spent millions on specialists, traveled to consultations across the country, read every book written about autism intervention. And in one moment, watching a housekeeper sit quietly on the floor while her son appeared calmer than he had in months, everything she thought she knew crumbled. She wanted to be angry. Part of her was angry at Grace for overstepping, at herself for missing something so simple, at the universe for making this so complicated. But a larger part was desperate. "Tell me," Victoria said, coming into the room slowly. "Tell me what you see that 7 trained nannies didn't." Grace chose her words carefully. "I see a boy who's overwhelmed, not defiant, not difficult. Just overwhelmed. The specialist said he needs structure, stimulation, and engagement. Maybe he needs the opposite." Victoria lowered herself onto James's bed, her designer clothes wrinkling, her perfect posture finally collapsing. "You said your son had similar struggles. Marcus, he's 19 now, in college studying computer science." Grace kept her voice low, calm. "When he was young, everyone kept telling me he needed more therapy, more intervention, more structure. But he didn't need more, he needed less. Less noise, less light, less touching, less expectation. But the doctors see one version of autism," Grace said gently, "a textbook version, but every child is different. Marcus couldn't handle fluorescent lights, gave him terrible headaches. But it took 2 years before anyone believed me because I was just his mother, not a professional." Victoria looked at James, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in months. He was still sitting quietly, his hands in his lap, his breathing even. The constant tension that usually vibrated through his small body had eased. "What am I doing wrong?" Victoria's voice cracked. "I've tried everything." "You're trying too hard," Grace said. "Everyone's trying too hard. They come in here with their schedules and their techniques and their constant talking, and they're all overwhelming him more. But he needs to learn to communicate. To function, he's 5 years old," Grace said firmly. "Right now he needs to feel safe. Everything else can come later." Victoria was silent for a long moment. Then, "The lights bother him. I think so, and the smells. This room smells like a chemical factory. The cleaning products, the air fresheners, the scented detergent on his sheets. It's overpowering. I never noticed. You're used to it, but for someone with sensitive senses, Grace trailed off. There's also the noise. Your house is never quiet. Always something humming, beeping, playing music. And people are always touching him, hugging him, patting his head, holding his hand. They think they're being affectionate, but to him, it might feel like an assault. Victoria's hands were shaking. So what do I do? First, can I try something? With your permission? Victoria nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Grace slowly stood and crossed to James's closet. She began removing items, brightly colored toys, musical gadgets, textured sensory items that specialists had recommended. She piled them outside the room. Then she went to the windows and adjusted the curtains so they blocked most of the light but allowed a soft glow. She found the smart home control panel and disabled the air fresheners. I'll need to clean this room again, Grace said. With plain water, no products, and his sheets, do you have any that haven't been washed in scented detergent? I think so, in the linen closet. From before he was born, maybe. Get those. Plain cotton, nothing fancy. Victoria hesitated, then left the room. Grace could hear her opening the hallway linen closet, pulling out sheets that probably hadn't been touched in years. While Victoria was gone, Grace noticed James watching her. Not directly, his gaze was slightly to the left, but watching nonetheless. She sat back down on the floor, careful to maintain distance. You're okay, she said softly. No one's going to make you do anything. James's hand moved, just slightly, reaching toward her but not touching. Grace extended her hand, palm up, and left it there. An invitation, not a demand. James stared at her hand for a long time. Then, so slowly it seemed to take forever, he reached out and placed his fingertips against her palm. The lightest touch, lasting only a second before he pulled back, but it was the first voluntary touch he'd initiated in 6 months. Victoria returned with the old sheets and stopped in the doorway, witnessing the moment. Tears streamed down her face, silent and unstoppable. Grace turned to her. Mrs. Montgomery, I know you need to think about this. I know I overstepped my position, and I understand if you want me to leave. But I'm asking you to try this, just for a few days. Dim lights, no scents, no unnecessary noise, and no forced interaction. Let him come to people instead of people always coming to him. Victoria wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. You really think it could help? I think it's worth trying, because what you've been doing isn't working. It was a bold statement, borderline insubordinate, but Victoria didn't fire her. Instead, she nodded slowly. 3 days, Victoria said. I'll try it for 3 days. But you, she paused. You stay, help me, show me what to do. Ma'am, I'm not qualified. I'm not a therapist, or I don't need another therapist, Victoria said, her voice steady now, decided. I need someone who sees my son as a person, not a problem to be solved. Can you do that? Grace met her eyes. Yes, ma'am, I can do that. The next 3 days were unlike anything the Montgomery estate had ever experienced. Grace arrived each morning and spent hours not cleaning, but observing and adjusting James's environment. She replaced the chemical cleaning products with plain water and vinegar. The smell of artificial lemon and lavender faded, replaced by nothing, just clean, neutral air. She removed the colorful educational posters from James's walls. The sensory room was stripped down to basics: soft mats, plain pillows, dim lighting, no music, no bright colors, no overwhelming textures. She had Victoria order blackout curtains and soft, warm-toned lamps. The harsh overhead lighting was disconnected. The smart home devices in James's wing were silenced. No more beeping, no more automated announcements, no more ambient music. Victoria followed Grace's instructions with the desperation of a drowning woman grasping at a rope. She swapped James's bright, character-covered clothing for soft, plain cotton shirts and pants with no tags or rough seams. She eliminated all scented products from his bathroom, no soap, just water. No shampoo, just gentle, unscented cleansers, but the hardest change was behavioral. You can't force him to engage, Grace explained on the second day. Stop trying to make him look at you, talk to you, hug you. When he wants contact, he'll initiate it. Until then, just exist near him, let him get used to your presence without expectation. It went against everything Victoria had been taught. Every specialist had emphasized engagement, eye contact, structured interaction. But she was out of options, so she tried. She sat in James's room each evening, reading her own book while he played quietly in his corner. She didn't try to narrate his play or encourage him to share. She just read, occasionally glancing at him but never forcing interaction. The first evening, James ignored her completely. The second evening, he moved slightly closer to where she sat. The third evening, he brought a toy car and rolled it across the floor between them. Not to her, not as an invitation to play, but as an acknowledgement that she was there and maybe, just maybe, wasn't a threat. Victoria's heart nearly burst. She wanted to scoop him up, praise him, and make a big celebration of this tiny gesture. But she remembered Grace's words, no big reactions. Just accept what he offers and don't demand more. So Victoria simply rolled the car back, then returned to her book. James took the car, rolled it again, this time slightly closer. They played this way for 15 minutes, the slowest, quietest, most understated game ever played between mother and child. But it was the first real interaction Victoria had had with her son in months. Grace continued arriving 3 times a week, but her role had shifted. She still cleaned, but she also observed, advised, and documented the changes in James's behavior. Victoria had offered to pay her more, to officially hire her as some kind of consultant, but Grace had refused anything beyond her normal hourly rate. She didn't want money. She wanted James to be okay. By the end of the second week, the changes were undeniable. James's violent meltdowns had decreased from multiple times daily to maybe once every few days. He was sleeping through the night. He'd started eating more, now that mealtimes weren't battles of forced engagement. He still didn't speak, but his humming had evolved into different tones, some curious, some content, some still distressed, but far less frequent. Victoria was transformed. The exhaustion lifted from her face. She smiled more, relaxed more. She started taking James outside in the early morning when the garden was quiet and the light was soft. No goals, no therapy objectives, just existing together in a gentle space. Grace should have been relieved. This was working. James was improving. Her job was done, but something nagged at her, something she couldn't quite name. It started with small things she noticed while cleaning. In Victoria's home office, there were documents from James's various evaluations. Grace shouldn't have looked. It wasn't her place, but she found herself reading them while dusting the desk. Most were standard reports from specialists, full of clinical language and recommendations. But one caught her attention. It was from Dr. Patricia Brennan, the behavioral specialist who'd recommended institutional care. The report was thorough, but one section stood out: patients present with extreme sensitivity to environmental stimuli. However, this sensitivity appears to have worsened significantly in the past 6 months. Initial evaluation, conducted at patients' 1-year follow-up, indicated moderate sensory processing differences. The current presentation suggests severe dysfunction. Recommend investigation into environmental factors that may have triggered this regression. Grace read the passage 3 times. Regression, something had gotten worse. But what? She thought back over what Victoria had told her about James's history. He'd been diagnosed at 3, but his symptoms hadn't been severe initially. Moderate challenges, manageable with support. But around his 5th birthday, about 6 months ago, everything had deteriorated. The violent meltdowns started, the complete withdrawal, the regression that had led to the parade of failing nannies 6 months ago. At the same time, Grace had started working at the Montgomery estate, but that was a coincidence, wasn't it? Grace couldn't shake the feeling. That night, she lay awake again, her mind cycling through everything she knew. Something had changed 6 months ago. Something environmental. The next morning, she arrived at the estate early, before her scheduled time. Victoria was surprised to see her. "Grace, is everything okay? Mrs. Montgomery, can I ask you something?" 6 months ago, when James's condition got worse, did anything else change in the house? Victoria frowned, thinking, I don't think so. Why? Dr. Brennan's report mentioned environmental factors. Something made him regress. I'm trying to figure out what. Victoria looked troubled. 6 months ago, that was around when we did the renovation. We updated the east wing, new flooring, new paint, new HVAC system. It was supposed to be an improvement, using all the latest smart home technology. Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. New paint? Yes, the nursery had old paint from when my husband was alive. I wanted everything fresh, modern. The contractor said they used the best materials, low VOC, eco-friendly. Did James's symptoms start during the renovation or after? Victoria's face went pale as she made the connection. During. Right after they finished his room, I thought he was reacting to the disruption of the construction, but the meltdowns continued even after the workers left. They got worse. Grace moved quickly to the stairs. I need to check something. She went to James's room, Victoria following close behind. Grace examined the walls carefully, running her hands along the paint. It looked perfect, smooth, even, a soft blue color that designers had probably called calming. But Grace knew that what looked perfect on the surface could hide problems underneath. Mrs. Montgomery, who did you hire for the renovation? A company called Premier Home Solutions. They came highly recommended, expensive, but supposed to be the best. Grace pulled out her phone and did a quick search. What she found made her blood run cold. There's a class action lawsuit against them. Multiple families reported that their eco-friendly paint contained hidden volatile organic compounds that weren't disclosed. Several children developed respiratory problems, headaches, and, she scrolled further, and neurological symptoms that mimicked or exacerbated conditions like autism and ADHD. Victoria's hand went to her mouth. Oh my God, the symptoms match exactly what happened to James. The paint has been slowly releasing chemicals into the air. You can't smell it, but for someone with sensory sensitivities, it's been poisoning him, Victoria whispered. This whole time, I thought there was something wrong with him and I was poisoning him. Within an hour, Victoria had contractors at the estate, not to renovate but to test. They took air quality samples, scraped paint chips, analyzed the materials used in the East Wing renovation. Grace watched as Victoria transformed from a helpless mother into a warrior, demanding answers, threatening lawsuits, making calls to attorneys and environmental specialists. The results came back within 48 hours. The paint in James's room and throughout the East Wing was releasing formaldehyde and other compounds at levels that exceeded safety standards, especially for children. The eco-friendly label had been misleading at best, fraudulent at worst. How long will it take to remove it all? Victoria demanded of the contractor on the phone. I don't care about cost. How fast can you strip every room and repaint with materials that are actually safe? The contractor said something Grace couldn't hear. Then hire more people, work around the clock. I want this done in 3 days, and I want independent testing to verify everything is safe. My son's health depends on this. While Victoria handled the logistics, Grace focused on James. They moved him to the West Wing, to a guest room that hadn't been renovated, where the old paint and original HVAC system remained unchanged. Grace cleaned it with plain water, Victoria brought in his toys and clothes, and they created a temporary space for him. The change was almost immediate. Within 24 hours of being in the clean room, James's color improved. The dark circles under his eyes began to fade. His breathing, which had been slightly labored in a way no one had really noticed until now, became easier. He's been suffering this whole time, Victoria said, sitting on the floor of the guest room while James played nearby. 6 months of suffering, and I was so busy bringing in specialists and nannies that I never thought to check if I was the one hurting him. You didn't know, Grace said gently. I should have known. I'm his mother. I should have. Victoria's voice broke. And you're not even family. You're not a specialist. You're just. She stopped, realizing how that sounded. I'm just the cleaning woman, Grace finished softly. Who knows what houses hide, because I've spent 30 years looking at what people don't see. Victoria met her eyes. I'm sorry, for dismissing you, for almost firing you when you tried to tell me, for assuming that credentials mattered more than observation. Most people assume that. Most people are wrong. 3 days later, the East Wing had been completely stripped and repainted with materials that passed every safety test. The HVAC system had been professionally cleaned and upgraded with new filters. Independent environmental specialists certified that the air quality was now safe. But the real test came when they brought James back to his room. Grace walked with him slowly, Victoria beside her, both women tense with worry. What if the trauma of the space was too much? What if he associated the room with suffering now? James paused at the threshold of his room. He looked inside, his expression unreadable. Grace held her breath. Then James walked in. He moved to the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in. The plain walls, the soft lighting, the clean, neutral air. And then he hummed. That musical, peaceful hum that Grace had first heard weeks ago. Victoria sank onto his bed, tears streaming down her face. He knows. He can tell it's different. Over the next week, James's transformation accelerated. With the environmental toxins removed and the overwhelming stimulation reduced, he began to emerge from the defensive shell he'd built. He started making eye contact, brief glances that lasted only seconds but felt like miracles. His meltdowns became rare, and when they happened, they were manageable, a few minutes of distress, not hours of screaming. One morning, 2 weeks after the renovation fix, Grace was cleaning James's bathroom when she heard a sound from his bedroom that made her freeze. A word, a single word, quiet but clear. Grace. She dropped her cleaning cloth and rushed to the bedroom. James was sitting on his floor with his toy cars, not looking at her directly, but clearly having called her name. "Did you?" Grace's voice was shaking. "Did you say my name?" James was quiet for a moment. Then, "Grace, stay." 2 words. The first 2 words he'd spoken in Victoria's presence in over a year. Grace lowered herself to the floor, her professional composure crumbling. "I'll stay, sweetheart. I'll stay as long as you need me." Victoria appeared in the doorway, having heard from the hallway. She stood frozen, witnessing her son speak for the first time in so long. But she had learned. She didn't rush in, didn't make a big celebration. She simply smiled and gave Grace a look of pure gratitude. That evening, after Grace had finished her shift and was preparing to leave, Victoria stopped her in the foyer. "I'm hiring you," Victoria said, "not as cleaning staff. As I don't know what's your title, childcare specialist. Family consultant." Grace shook her head. "I'm not qualified for those titles." "Then what are you qualified for?" "I'm qualified to see what others miss," Grace said simply. "And I'm qualified to know that every child, no matter what challenges they have, deserves to be understood instead of fixed." Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "This is a contract. I had my attorney draw it up. It offers you a position as James's primary caregiver and my personal consultant on his needs. The salary is 6 times what you're making now, with full benefits, and your only job is to continue doing what you've been doing, seeing what others miss." Grace stared at the envelope, not taking it. "Mrs. Montgomery, I have other clients, other families who need me. You can keep them, part-time, full-time, whatever you want. I just need to know that you'll be here for James. That when I can't figure out what he needs, you'll help me see it." Grace finally took the envelope. Inside was an offer that would change her life, that would mean Marcus could finish college without loans, that would mean financial security she'd never known. But that wasn't why she accepted. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "Not for the money, though I won't lie and say it doesn't matter. I'll do it because James deserves someone in his corner who listens when he can't speak." 3 weeks later, the transformation of James Montgomery had become undeniable. He was speaking more, short phrases, simple requests, always quiet but increasingly frequent. He made eye contact when he felt comfortable. He'd started joining Victoria for breakfast, sitting at the table without being forced, eating without battles. But Grace knew there was still one more piece missing. Something she'd been researching, consulting with specialists, who now, ironically, were calling her for advice after Victoria spread word of James's improvement and carefully considering. She approached Victoria one afternoon in the garden, where Victoria was watching James explore the flower beds at his own pace. "Mrs. Montgomery, I think James needs a full developmental evaluation. Not the kind he's had before, not people trying to fix him, but people who can understand what he needs going forward. Speech therapy, maybe occupational therapy, but done right." On his terms, Victoria's face clouded with old fears. "The last time we tried therapy, this will be different," Grace said firmly, "because now we know what doesn't work. We find therapists who will come here, work in his space, follow his lead instead of forcing him to follow theirs. And I'll be there every session, making sure no one overwhelms him again." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Find them, interview them, and if you don't trust them, we don't hire them." Grace spent the next week reaching out to specialists who understood sensory-sensitive approaches. She found a speech therapist who specialized in nonverbal children and believed in respecting communication in all its forms, not just spoken words. She found an occupational therapist who focused on building confidence rather than compliance. She vetted them carefully, interviewed them extensively, and made it clear that James's comfort was the only metric that mattered. When they arrived for their first sessions, Grace supervised every moment. The speech therapist sat on the floor at James's level, didn't force eye contact, and accepted his hums and gestures as valid communication. The occupational therapist brought activities, but let James choose what interested him, never forcing participation. And slowly, carefully, James began to trust professional help again. Meanwhile, Victoria had not forgotten about Premier Home Solutions and their toxic paint. With the same determination she'd shown in building her business empire, she went after the company with full legal force. The lawsuit was filed in early November. Victoria hired the best attorneys and made it personal. She gave interviews to local news stations, warning other families. She connected with other parents who'd been affected. The case grew from one family's complaint to a class-action lawsuit representing dozens of children who'd suffered neurological symptoms after their homes were painted with Premier's products. The company initially tried to settle quietly, offering Victoria a large sum to drop the case and sign a non-disclosure agreement. She refused. "This isn't about money," she told her attorney, with Grace sitting beside her in support. "It's about making sure no other child goes through what James did. I want their products recalled. I want public accountability. I want criminal charges if possible." The case made headlines. The Billionaire Mother versus Big Paint story captured public attention, but what really drove the narrative was Victoria's honesty about her own mistakes. In a televised interview, she said, "I had every resource available, and I still almost lost my son. Not because of his autism, but because I trusted the wrong people and didn't listen to the right one. If I can make that mistake with all my advantages, how many other families are suffering in silence?" The interviewer asked. "Who was the right person you didn't listen to?" Victoria smiled. "My son's caregiver, Grace Williams, a woman I initially hired to clean my house and almost fired when she tried to tell me what my son needed. She saved him, not with credentials or expensive techniques, but with observation and experience and a mother's understanding of when something is wrong." She invited Grace to join the interview. Grace had initially refused. She didn't want attention, but Victoria convinced her that her story mattered. Sitting in the television studio, uncomfortable in the spotlight, Grace spoke about her own journey. About raising Marcus, about learning to trust her instincts even when professionals dismissed her, about the importance of seeing children as individuals rather than diagnoses. The interview went viral. Suddenly, Grace was receiving calls from other families, other mothers who'd been dismissed and ignored. She started a small consulting practice, helping families create sensory-friendly environments and advocating for children who couldn't advocate for themselves. But through it all, her primary commitment remained to James. By December, 6 months after Grace first noticed James suffering, the lawsuit reached its critical phase. Premier Home Solutions was facing criminal charges for fraud and endangering children. The trial required testimony from affected families. Victoria testified first, describing the nightmare of watching her son suffer and not knowing why. Medical experts testified about the neurological effects of the chemical exposure. Environmental specialists presented evidence of the deception in Premier's eco-friendly labeling. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. James, with Grace beside him and special accommodations made for his needs, testified, not in words, he wasn't ready for that kind of public speaking, but through a video recording that Grace had helped him create, using pictures he'd drawn and a few spoken words, supported by written statements that Victoria read aloud. The drawing showed a small figure in a dark room. Bright colors attacking from all sides, hands drawn as large and threatening, reaching toward the small figure. And then a second drawing, the same room but softer. A person standing nearby Grace, clearly not reaching but simply present, and the small figure standing upright instead of curled in defense. "This is how I felt," Victoria read from James's statement, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. "The bad smell hurt my nose. The bright lights hurt my eyes. Everyone was too loud and touched me too much, and I wanted it to stop, but no one understood." The courtroom was silent. The jury looked at the drawings, at the simple testimony of a child who'd been unable to speak his suffering until someone finally listened. The verdict came back in 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Premier Home Solutions was fined millions, their products recalled, and several executives faced criminal charges. The settlement for the class action lawsuit ensured that every affected family would receive compensation for medical expenses and damages. But for Victoria and Grace, the victory wasn't in the money. It was in the system being held accountable, in other children being protected, in James's voice finally being heard. The June sun filtered through the new curtains in James's room, curtains he'd helped choose, pointing to the soft blue fabric that pleased him without overwhelming his senses. Grace sat in her usual spot on the floor, now with a comfortable cushion that Victoria had insisted on, watching James build an elaborate structure with blocks. He was 7 now, speaking in full sentences when he chose to, though he still preferred his peaceful humming when words felt like too much. He attended a special school that understood sensory needs, had friends who accepted his different way of communicating, and was thriving in ways no one had imagined possible 2 years ago. "Grace," he said, not looking up from his blocks, "will you stay for dinner?" It was something he asked often now. Grace had moved beyond employee, beyond consultant, into something more like family. She ate with them several times a week, celebrated holidays at the estate, and had become as much a part of James's support system as Victoria herself. "If your mom doesn't mind," Grace replied. "I never mind," Victoria said from the doorway. She'd changed too, less rigid, more present, having learned that being a mother wasn't about having all the answers, but about being willing to learn. "Besides, James is helping me cook tonight." He picked the recipe. James stood up, his movements still careful and deliberate, and crossed to Grace. He held out his hand, an invitation, not a demand. Grace took it, and together they walked downstairs to the kitchen where Victoria had ingredients laid out. As they cooked together, James stirring carefully, Victoria chopping vegetables, Grace supervising with quiet encouragement, it struck Grace how much had changed. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress of perfection, but like a home. The silence was no longer oppressive, but peaceful. The child who'd been labeled unreachable was reaching out in his own way, at his own pace. Later that night, after dinner and after Grace had said goodbye and driven back to her apartment in Brooklyn, she sat on her small balcony and thought about the journey. She'd been invisible for so long, the cleaning woman, the help, the person who wasn't supposed to have opinions or observations. And it has taken a suffering child and a desperate mother for anyone to realize that sometimes the most important insights come from the people society trains us to overlook. Her phone buzzed, a text from Victoria, "Thank you for everything, for seeing him when no one else would." Grace typed back, "Thank you for finally listening." But the real thanks, the deepest gratitude, was wordless. It was in James's drawings that now covered Victoria's office. pictures of flowers and cars, and the three of them together, simple sketches that spoke of safety and understanding. It was in the calls Grace received from other families, other children being helped, because James's story had shown that difference wasn't broken. It was in Marcus, who'd graduated with honors and called his mother weekly to tell her how proud he was of what she'd done. The world still had a long way to go. There were still children suffering in silence, still parents not being heard, still people like Grace being dismissed because they didn't have the right credentials or the right skin color or the right social status. But James's story had opened one door, had shown one path, and had proved that sometimes salvation comes not from the experts we hire, but from the people we almost overlook. In the end, the most important voice hadn't come from degrees or experience or professional training. It had come from a mother's heart, from a cleaner's careful observation, from a child's desperate attempt to be understood. And together they'd created something beautiful, not a cure, not a fix, but an understanding. A space where a child could be himself, could communicate in his own way, could thrive not by changing who he was, but by being accepted for exactly who he'd always been. Sometimes the whisper that changes everything isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's as quiet as a cleaning woman saying, "He needs you to leave him alone." Sometimes it's as simple as dimming the lights and removing the poison. Sometimes the greatest intervention is knowing when to stop intervening and start listening. And sometimes the person no one was paying attention to is the one who saves everyone.